Okay, so we're continuing on in John's Gospel tonight. I'm prepared to cover verses 12 through 22 of chapter 19.
今日は22節ぐらいまで19章を進みたいと思ってます。
Everybody is a fairly regular student, although some people have rejoined us recently. So let me just again touch on the introduction part. The Gospel according to John is one of the 4 books in the Bible, which we call Gospels. Each of them is a biography of Jesus, a story of the life of Jesus. The Gospel according to John is one of the 5 books in the New Testament that were written by or under the authority of the Apostle John. And like all the books in the New Testament, the Gospel according to John was first written in Greek and has since been translated into the languages that we read. You can outline John's Gospel. One of the ways you can outline it is the way I've done on this slide, dividing it into 5 main parts. The prologue, where we're reminded that the one who would become Jesus was with God in the beginning. Then 11 and a half chapters all the way till the end of chapter 12, which are devoted to John's recollection of Jesus' public ministry. Followed then in chapters 13 through 17 by John's memory of the time Jesus spent alone with his disciples prior to his crucifixion. Then the section that we're in now, chapters 18, 19, and 20, which have to do with the arrest and the trial and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And then John's Gospel will end in chapter 21 with an epilogue that speaks of several resurrection appearances in Galilee. And again, we're in the gray part here, chapters 18, 19, and 20, specifically in chapter 19. Compared to last week, as I try to do every week, sort of compressed the review. And so to just quickly review chapters 18, the parts of chapter 19 that we've covered in a few slides, let me do that. Jesus, after the long prayer and the meal that they shared together, Jesus then allowed himself, but not his disciples, to be taken captive by a group of Roman soldiers and temple guards and Roman and Jewish officials in the Garden of Gethsemane. At least that's what the other gospel authors call it. That's the first 14 verses of chapter 18. And it's important to notice that Jesus basically allows this to happen to him. John makes us see that Jesus knows what's going to happen, that Jesus is in control of the situation completely, that Jesus is not overpowered or surprised. Jesus is going where he knows that he needs to go, onward to the cross and beyond. So Jesus goes with this large group of people to the house of Annas, who's the father-in-law of the high priest Caiaphas, and Peter and another disciple follow along after him. And there for the first time, John remembers Peter denied Jesus. A girl by the door said, "Aren't you also one of the disciples?" And Peter said, "No, I'm not." Peter sort of denied that he knew who Jesus was. Then Jesus was questioned by the high priest about his disciples and his teaching, and Jesus basically didn't say anything. What he said was, "I've been speaking openly about all of these things. Why do you ask me? Ask the people who heard me. They know what they said. I haven't said anything in secret." So Jesus is basically saying that people knew what he was teaching during 3.5 years of public ministry, and there was no reason to be asking him now what it was about. The temple guard thought Jesus was being disrespectful, which he really was, and struck him, and then they bound Jesus and they sent him off to Caiaphas, who was the high priest there. That's when John remembers Peter denying Jesus a second time and a third time before the rooster crowed, just as Jesus expected would happen. When he said, "Before the cock crows, you'll deny me 3 times," Peter did. And all 4 of the Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all remember the story of Peter's denial of Jesus. It's clear that the Jewish crowds, and especially the Jewish leadership, are very specifically interested in trying to convince the Romans to crucify Jesus. We know, and have known for some chapters, that the Jewish leadership wanted Jesus dead. And now, in John's recollection of events, it becomes quite clear to everyone that they're trying to encourage the Roman governor Pilate to take Jesus and crucify him. And yet when Pilate asked them, what charge do you bring against this man, they are at first, for some time, not at all clear what they're charging Jesus with. They just mumble something like, well, we wouldn't have brought him to you if you weren't guilty of sin, but they won't actually make a charge against him. So Pilate several times says, I find no guilt with him. I find no guilt with him. After questioning Jesus, including about whether Jesus was the king of the Jews, something Pilate might have heard said about Jesus, Pilate still comes back and says, I find no guilt with him. And so, look, Pilate says to these Jews, why don't I just give Jesus back to you? You have a tradition. On the Passover, I can release somebody that's held captive by me. I'll release Jesus. That'll get everybody off the hook. But in fact, the crowd says, no, we don't want Jesus. Give us instead some other man named Barabbas, who was a thief that was under arrest at the same time. So, again, repeating his finding that Jesus is innocent, Pilate nevertheless has Jesus flogged, which means beaten. And then they put a crown on his head and they dress him up like a kind of an imitation king, and they make a parody of the king, and they humiliate him and they flog him. And yet the people don't react to that even with mercy. They're crying out, seeing this pitiful spectacle of Jesus treating him that way. Crucify him, crucify him. And so now the Jews are kind of stuck. They want Pilate to crucify Jesus, but Pilate hasn't found any guilt in him. They haven't made any specific charge against him. Right? So finally in verse 7 of chapter 19, the Jews make a specific charge against Jesus. And now what they're accusing him of is a religious infraction. They say, we have a charge against him for which he is liable to death, and that is that he makes himself to be the Son of God. They say this to Pilate. And when Pilate hears that Jesus may be a son of God, his Roman mind makes him afraid. They had many gods, and they have many stories about men who were sons of gods. And hearing this, now Pilate is afraid, and he calls Jesus back and he says, tell me again, where do you come from? Remember, before Jesus had said, my kingdom is not of this world. I came into this world to bear witness to the truth. Now somebody's saying this guy is a god. Pilate asked Jesus, where do you come from? But now Jesus is finished talking. He won't answer that question by Pilate. But like Kenji said, Kenji couldn't be here tonight, but Kenji said last week a really good point, I thought, was that Pilate must have been afraid of Jesus, because here he is with all of his power as a Roman governor. And he told Jesus, I have the power to turn you free, and I have the power to kill you. And Jesus wasn't afraid of him. Even after he'd been beaten and humiliated, Jesus actually had a kind word for Pilate. So that probably just would have added to the fear that Pilate had, that there was something about this guy Jesus that was a little bit frightening to him. Right? So that's a review of where we've gotten so far. I mean, I just wanted to sum up all of that then before we read on. All right? So remember in John's Gospel, we're almost finished with John's Gospel, and for a long time in our reading, we've been hearing repeatedly that the Jewish leaders have wanted to kill Jesus. Usually they say that they're angry at Jesus, they hate Jesus, they want to kill Jesus, they want to arrest Jesus. Whenever Jesus is claiming to be one with the Father, and when he's claiming to be the Son of God, that's when they become angry and they want to kill him. And now at this late stage in the story, they've made it quite clear to people all around, including Pilate himself, that they want Pilate to take Jesus and kill Jesus for them. And specifically, they want Jesus crucified. They don't want to stone him to death for temple infractions. They want Jesus crucified for some reason. Pilate, we can see, is not a sympathetic man. He doesn't have a reputation outside the Bible either for being a particularly nice man. He's not that interested in justice, because even though he says Jesus is innocent, he still has him flogged, right? And so he's not a nice man or a perfect man, which makes him the perfect witness to Jesus' innocence. Again and again and again, Pilate finds Jesus innocent. He says, I don't find any fault with him. right? And finally, the Jews have to resort to a Jewish thing and say, okay, he's guilty of an infraction against Jewish law for which he could be put to death, namely that he makes himself to be the Son of God. And then John says that made Pilate afraid. And we discussed this last week, but why Pilate was afraid of Jesus could have several parts. And you think about this yourself. I think some of them are political and some of them are sort of religious or superstitious. Politically, of course, Pilate's always going to be nervous about anything in the situation in Jerusalem that could have an outcome that makes him look bad in Rome. His power and his wealth and everything depends on him remaining governor in Judea, which he'll only do so long as Caesar is happy with the job that he's doing. So he might have been afraid of a real uprising led by Jesus, if Jesus really was going out trying to recruit people to follow him as the king of the Jews. But it's become quite clear in this story that Jesus is not such a king. He doesn't claim to be such a king. He has not one follower that stands up to defend him. Nobody does anything. They don't. Pilate offers to give back, and they say, no, we don't want him, right? There's nobody in Israel claiming Jesus as their king. So Pilate really can't be too much afraid that Jesus is going to lead an uprising as a king of the Jews. He might be afraid of some sort of trumped-up charge that the Jews might develop, and that seems to be the way things were going. They have friends in Rome. They might send a message back to Rome and say, there's a guy in Judea who's making himself out to be a king here, and obviously that means he's an enemy of Caesar, and so Pilate should be against him, but instead Pilate let him go, right? So he could be afraid that showing leniency to Jesus would get him in trouble with somebody who's powerful in Rome. But also I think John wants us to see that part of the fear has to do with Pilate's fear, Pilate's belief that maybe there is something to this Son of God business. Pilate sees something in Jesus that gives him pause, you know. He's not afraid when he's questioned, even when he's beaten. The way he speaks wasn't like the way anybody else spoke. He's heard rumors that Jesus is the Son of God, and all kinds of stories people have probably heard about Jesus healing and his miracles and all of that. And so there's some of that kind of fear also mixed in. And I think Pilate basically is afraid of several things, probably where Jesus is concerned.
Yeah, I was thinking, Karl Barth made that point in Romans that the Gentiles understand what's right and wrong. So why wouldn't they also see that people who are religious and claim to have God's word and all that, if they're sinning, they understand that that's sin. So I kind of always read Pilate to mean that, or that passage to mean that Pilate was sensing that.
Power of God in Jesus.
Yeah.
I think so too, in the end. And the thing is, as Christians, we know and believe that Jesus is God. Pilate was standing there with God. And all the sin that we have and all the corruption that there is can blind everyone from almost everything. But even still, he was standing that close to God incarnate. Even Pilate could pick up something of that, right? There's something about this guy which is different, and it makes me reluctant to just crucify him. Plus the fact that the whole nation of Israel seems to be up in arms about something, right? And if you were a normal person, they wouldn't be reacting that way. They're obviously not in favor of him, right? They're asking the Romans to crucify him for some reason. He doesn't know why.
Yeah, if he was a wacko or something.
That's right. If he were insane, nobody would be doing anything. Right? Okay, so that's kind of where we are with the life story of Jesus. Jesus is still in custody. He's willingly turned himself over. It's the Jews who keep pressing for his execution. So far, the one guy who's refusing to have him crucified is
で、
Pilate,
ユ
the
ダヤ
Roman
の人たち
governor.
は彼を十字架にかけようと
And now we see what
訴えている
happens
最中ですね。
Okay, so let's read from 12 to 16 in
16
Japanese.
節まで、読んで7節でかしら、持ってます。はい、19章の12から16まで読んでください。
はい、これを聞いてピラトはイエスを許そうと努めた。しかしユダヤ人たちが叫んでいった。もしこの人を許したなら、あなたはカイザルの味方ではありません。自分を王とするのはすべてカイザルに背くものです。ピラトはこれらの言葉を聞いてイエスを外へ引き出していき、敷居し、ヘブル語ではガバタという場所で裁判の席に着いた。その日は杉越の準備の日であって、時は昼の12時頃であった。ピラトはユダヤ人らに言った。見よ、これがあなた方の王だ。すると彼らは叫んだ。殺せ、殺せ、彼を十字架につけよ。ピラトは彼らに言った。あなた方の王を私が十字架につけるのか。祭司長たちは答えた。私たちにはカイザル以外に王はありません。そこでピラトは十字架につけさせるためにイエスを彼らに引き渡した。
ありがとうございます。
From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha? I'm not sure. Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. Let's see, is that? Oh, so they took Jesus.
Okay, I think the last part of the Japanese you also did. Okay, so the story of the Passion of Christ continues. So verse 12 of chapter 19, again, says, "From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, 'If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes him a king, himself a king, opposes Caesar. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar.'" Right? So, again, Pilate has for a long time known that Jesus is innocent. He's said so now 3 or 4 times. Clearly, he can see, as we can by reading the story, Jesus can't possibly be guilty of plotting to lead a royal revolt in Judea. It's not going to happen. But Pilate's sense of justice is not his most important motive. I don't think anybody would ever say that. It seems mostly to me like he's motivated by fear of one kind or another. And I think that's true of most human beings. That's a powerful motive for him. He tries to avoid the things that he's afraid of. He's just heard that Jesus' father may be a god, and he comes out of a culture where hearing that somebody's father might actually be a god can give you pause. It's not like, I think, a modern 20th century American who say, "My father is God," and we're not so worried. We don't think that's probably true, but in his culture, he might have thought so, and that might have taken him back. Jesus has shown no fear of Pilate's authority, even though he's in a situation where a normal human being would have shown fear, and Jesus is not afraid of it. Katie said last week. And after being flogged, Jesus has actually spoken a kind word to Pilate. Remember? He said to Pilate, "The sin of the one who delivered me to you is greater." Right? He's saying, it's really not your fault. Governor Pilate, it's the fault of the people who are pushing you into this, right? Jesus
で
understood
すから
that.
ピラトが悪いとは思いませんね。
By comparison,
そうやっ
the
て
Jews are behaving
強制したと
badly
いう
towards
ふうに
Pilate. They're screaming at him, they're demanding
もう
stuff,
人
they're being
々は
unruly
もう
and scary, really, from a political point of view. And I think if I'm Pilate, probably I'd love to deny their request just to spite them or just to prove that I have power, or just to keep them in their place. I'd rather side with Jesus than with them. Right? I mean, they're being a pain to him, and Jesus really isn't. So it makes sense then to me when it says here in verse 12 that from then on Pilate sought to release him, right? Because he has basically no reason to hold Jesus that you can think of, and he has several reasons to release him, right? It's just normal human logic would say Pilate wants to release him, you know, to make the Jews angry, whatever, to avoid any possibility of antagonizing some God somewhere who's Jesus' father, you know. Right? But so the Jews realize that they have to give Pilate a stronger reason to do what they want Pilate to do. And so they cry out. Pilate is seeking to release him. They got that. But the Jews are crying out now to give a reason why Pilate should kill Jesus. They're basically trying to make Pilate more afraid of them than Pilate is of Jesus, if I'm reading this the right way. Pilate's a little bit afraid of Jesus in the circumstances. But pretty soon he's going to be more afraid of the Jews, because what they say is the thing that he's most afraid of, probably, the thing you're most afraid of in the Roman world is having the Roman emperor upset at you, especially if you're a senior political official. And so they say, and they're not stupid, they say it because they know it's going to scare them, that if you release this man, you're not Caesar's friend. They're going to brand him an enemy of Caesar, if possible, if he releases Jesus, right? And they imply that Jesus has made himself out to be a king, and that it automatically follows that Jesus is in opposition to Caesar. And I think the meaning is that's the argument they would make to their friends in Rome, if Pilate lets Jesus loose. And even though Pilate has clearly seen and repeatedly said that he found no basis for this charge, that Jesus was trying to be a king in Judea, maybe the Jews could persuade other people in Rome that the charge is true, and that's what's got him worried, I think. That's his new fear, that wars with the fear that he had before of the Son of God. So, at the risk of stating the obvious, I mean, but Jesus hasn't been too hard on Pilate. He said the guilt really lies with those who have brought me to you. I just wanted to step back and say the following. Pilate has authority from Caesar, but ultimately from God, Jesus said, right? He said, you wouldn't have any authority unless it was given to you from above. So Pilate is on earth like all earthly leaders. The only reason he's a leader is because God has put him there. And his responsibility under this world's way of thinking, under the law, is to preserve law and order in Judea. He's the governor there. He's responsible for the safety of property and the safety of lives and the peaceful conduct of society and collecting taxes and all the kinds of stuff that government people have to do. And there's no sin in that, right? He's being a Roman governor. And where the preservation of law is concerned, his main responsibility, of course, as a Roman governor, is to safeguard the rights of Roman citizens. Judean citizens, not so much. That's the bad part of Roman rule. There's sort of two standards here. The standard is higher for Roman citizens, but still, that's his job. And the Jews are here now, almost threatening a riot if Pilate doesn't execute Jesus. They're screaming, crucify him, crucify him. And it seems to be a strictly Jewish thing, right? He's a fellow Jew that they're accusing. The basis of their charge sometimes it seems like is a religious thing peculiar to their community, nothing to do with Roman law. Several times Pilate says, why don't you crucify him under your own law? You know, it's nothing to do with me. And the point that I'm working up to is, but I'll add one more point. First is, he's got this fear also, his own personal fear, that if he releases Jesus, somebody's going to tell rumors about him back in Rome and persuade him that he's a friend to somebody who's a traitor against Rome and get his own self in trouble. Pilate finally has no choice but to execute Jesus. If I put my businessman's mind on, my worldly guy's mind on, I put myself in Pilate's shoes, I would execute Jesus, right? I mean, the only way you wouldn't execute Jesus is if you were a saint, right? Better than Peter is. He's denied Jesus 3 times. How would Pilate resist the pressure that he's under to put Jesus to death? You know, it's really hard to think how the Jews have painted him into a corner, so that he's going to have to do what they want. And if he gives them what they want, they'll come down, he'll preserve order in Judea, he won't violate the rights of any Roman citizens, he'll protect his own reputation before the Roman court. You know, it's a win-win-win situation. The only guy that loses if Jesus is crucified is Jesus from the worldly point of view, right? And surely Pilate's a worldly guy. But, you know, he couldn't have resisted the manipulation of the Jewish leaders unless he was, you know, some kind of remarkable saint, which he's not. Doesn't that seem that way to you guys? I mean, if the question is raised, who's really at fault here? The Jews or the Romans? And the answer should be both, because it was the power of Rome that put him to death. But on the other hand, Rome was the world, right? It is the world. It's just being the world, right? And the Jews have used the world and the sinfulness of the world and the sinful proclivities of people in the world, like Pilate, to kill Jesus. They know exactly what they're doing. And that's why Jesus is right when he says, the one who delivered you over to me has the greater sin. Right? It's somebody has actually premeditated the murder of Jesus, using the world as its instrument, right? Using Pilate as its instrument. So that's what we see happening here in verse 13. It says, so when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out, sat down on the judgment seat at the place they called the stone pavement, and in the Aramaic, Gabbatha. To me, Gabbatha sounds like a Japanese language school, but I guess it's...
Yeah,
so,
yeah, Gabbatha.
So the Jews have openly placed themselves on the side of Caesar, and they've clearly demanded that Pilate execute Jesus if he's really loyal to Caesar. That's the situation that Pilate is in. And Pilate really has no choice but to go ahead and pass this judgment.
仕事とか立場でもうチョイスがないっていうことですか
What does it mean that no choice means that
Like a president push the bombs buttons or 立場として
Let me put it this way.
Humanity is
The only reason why Pilate would not kill Jesus is if Pilate were a Christian.
もしイエスを殺さなかったとしたら、ピラトはクリスチャンだということになってしま
He's
う
not
んですね。
particularly evil. He's just being a Roman governor, and it's natural for him to do what
で
comes
も
next.
ピラトは殺されてしまって、
ピラトは殺されて
キリスト
それだけじゃなく
キリスト
キリストが殺されたんです。
いやだからそれをジーザスを許してしまったらピラトは多分殺されて。
What happened if that the pilot that released him, that the Pilate would be killed by someone?
Probably not, but
殺されはしないでしょう。
but what the Jews have threatened is
で
they'll
も
tell
ユダヤ人の人た
rumors
ちは脅しをかけるわけ
they'll
ですね
tell rumors to people in Rome that Pilate is sympathizing with some guy.
だからこの男の人に同情して、殺したと殺さないでいたっていうことは
Who's not a friend of Caesar? Who's
それは
against Rome?
もうカイサルに対して味方したことにはならないんだというふうに脅したわけですね、ユダヤの人たちユダヤ人
I don't know if I'm making a big point, but I think the only point I'm making is Pilate is not being particularly evil. He's just being human.
だからここではっきりしたいことはピラトは完全に悪い人ではないですね。人間なんです。
And the Jews know his situation, and they've used his situation.
わかるわけです。その立場を。
So the Jews are killing Jesus using Pilate as a tool almost, right?
だからその道具としてピラトをユダヤ人の人たちは使って殺すように仕向けたというふうに考えた方がいいと思います。
And so John remembers where the judgment happens. He said he brought the judgment seat was like a piece of furniture that he used to do judgment. And they brought it out because remember the Jews won't go inside. The Jews won't go inside because they're worried about being polluted on the day of Passover, and so he has to keep coming outside. So he comes out and he sets up his judgment seat outside on the stone pavement. And these are specific details which only John and none of the other gospel authors happen to remember. And John also remembers the time. It says it was the day of preparation of the Passover, about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." So in John's chronology, in John's time sequence, okay, in John's gospel, this is the day of preparation for Passover. What it means is Passover will be celebrated in the meal that night just after sundown. So this is the day before the Passover meal. And he said that the reason why the Jews won't go inside the headquarters of Pilate is because they don't want to be defiled on the day of the preparation. And he says it's about the 6th hour. And probably what that means is that it was noontime. Because the Jews counted time from sunup until sundown. So 0 is 6 a.m. So the 6th hour would be noon. Probably. If they're using the Jewish way of counting time, and probably they are.
だからユダヤ人の1日の数え方にのっとって明け方からお昼まで6時間ある。
So that's the 6th hour following sunup, therefore about noon on the day of Passover. And it's coming into the time of the day when people will be getting ready to slaughter the Passover lamb to celebrate Passover. And John, of course, is very mindful of the fact that Jesus, in another sense, is the Passover lamb, and Jesus is being shown to the people. And as the Passover lambs are being prepared to celebrate the Passover, Jesus is going to death also as the lamb that takes away the sin of the world. And this is the place then and the time, the day and the time and the place where Pilate says to the Jewish people, and this will be publicly out with not just the leaders but all the people, he says, "Behold your king." And the statement by Pilate is, of course, irony. It's ironical. The Jews are saying, "You better kill this guy because he's pretending to be a king," and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And there's Jesus beaten with a crown of thorns and a funny purple robe. And he's already said, "Behold the man, I see no sin in him." You know, it's being ironic. He's saying, "Here's the one who you say is your king," and he's nothing like a king, right? So from Pilate's worldly point of view, he's being ironic. But it's doubly ironic because to John, the author of the story, and to all the people who are reading the story, it's exactly true. Jesus is their king. So this is a hugely sort of multidimensional symbolic moment, where Jesus is not a king in the worldly sense, but he is a king in the eternal sense. And some people understand and some people don't. Okay. Multiple things are sort of true depending on who you are watching this. But it wouldn't be wrong to say that God the Father is using the mouth of Pilate, this earthly governor, to proclaim his son Jesus king in Israel.
これが王だっていう。
And so I may have said some of this already, but I mean, noon is a fitting time to present a nation with its king. Countries that have king, coronation ceremonies, like England and other countries that have kings, have very elaborate ceremonies and rules that they follow, where the new king will be taken out and introduced first to the north and the south and east and the west, and God save the king, and all. They have all kinds of stuff, right? Probably the emperor system has a Japanese version of that kind of stuff. You can look at it that way. I mean, Jesus is actually being formally presented to the Jews as their king here on noon on the day of Passover, right? And they're insisting that he be killed for exactly two reasons. They've used both, sort of. One is, they said, he claims to be the Son of God. Under our law, he's bound to die. And the other one is, they say to Pilate, you should kill him because he claims to be the king of Israel. And if you don't kill him, you're no friend of Caesar, right? So they're accusing him of Jesus of making himself to be the Son of God, and they're accusing Jesus of making himself to be a king, right? And here again, the irony is that in both of these ways, what they're accusing Jesus of is exactly true. Jesus has openly claimed to be both things, the Son of God, and if you understand it in the right way, the King of Israel. Okay? And as we've said before, it's what they don't understand is that Jesus is making these claims, but his claims are perfectly valid. Right? And so he's completely innocent. They're seeking to put him to death on the charge that he's claiming to be the two things that he exactly is. Right? The King of Israel and the Son of God. And so what they don't understand, or they wouldn't do it, is that their God and their Savior is the one who they're getting ready to crucify. And that's the weight of what's happening in the story. So then in verse 15, they cried out, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priest answered, we have no king but Caesar. So not only are the chief priests crying out again for the death of Jesus, who, even though they don't recognize it, is the true king of Israel, they're going one step beyond. They're sort of crossing over to the dark side. They're claiming Caesar is their only king, which overturns millennia of Jewish faith. Israel, if you read your Old Testament, the one thing that you should know is that God's chosen people, Israel, have no king except God or the anointed Messiah whom God will send to rule over them, if God should choose to do so. And here what the Jews are saying, and worse than that, the chief priests of the Jews are saying, is, we have no king but Caesar? They're saying that Caesar is the Messiah of Israel, or they're saying, I don't care about Israel anymore. I don't care about the religion of the Jews. This is basically the end of faith in Israel.
Apostasy.
The whole history of Israel is supposed to demonstrate Israel has no king but Yahweh and the ones that who he sends to rule. And here they're making the mistake of confusing Caesar with the Messiah of Israel. If you read the Revelation to John, it looks like scenes in there, right? The ruler of this world, who is Caesar, is being worshipped by the Jews as their king, while they kill the Son of God. Right? And I think John, you know, of all of the gospel authors, John is the most mindful of the deep symbolism here, right? I mean, he's really kept it lined up with the Passover ceremony. And I think if he were here, he would agree that we're reading it approximately the way he's writing it.
Yeah, that's the whole thing about the Passover is proving that God is the king even. So there they are in Passover. And they're declaring Caesar the king.
So this is, they've really in there, I mean, you could excuse them in a way for not recognizing that Jesus was king, because that's hard, right? That's hard to recognize, and people come to it, you know, at different times. But saying we have no king but Caesar is a step that no self-respecting Jew should ever take, right? And how misguided. But that's how worked up they are here. They're willing to claim that they're ruled by a secular authority, which is basically putting God out of the picture.
だからまあ今まで自分たちが持っていたその神様を完全に自分たちの側から外してしまったっていうところがものすごい。
So verse 16 continues and says, so he delivered him over to be crucified, so they took Jesus. So Israel has expressed its clear preference, right? They prefer Caesar to be their king, and they prefer that the true king and son of God, Jesus, to be killed. And they've said it again and again, and they've said it clearly. And Pilate's, if you think how God is using Pilate, he's sort of forced the Jews to say it again and again and clearly. The Jews have had many chances to sort of incriminate themselves. And so now Pilate's going to be the one to give them exactly what they've asked for. Right? He's going to give the Jews what they're asking for. And it says he delivered him over to them. And people talk about whether you should read that Pilate delivered Jesus over to the Jews, because in a sense, he did. He delivered Jesus over to the will of the Jews. They were the ones who wanted him dead, not Pilate. And so Pilate does deliver Jesus over to the Jews in that sense. But everyone, I think, understands that physically Pilate delivered Jesus over to the Roman soldiers who would take him out and have him executed. I don't think many people think the Jews had a hand in the physical part of the execution. And so that's where we are now. Jesus is going out with the Roman soldiers. So let's read on 17 to 22. 節から22節まで読んでみたいんですけど、もう一度お願いします。すいません。
イエスは自ら十字架を背負ってサレコベ、ヘブル語ではゴルゴダという場所に出て行かれた。彼らはここでイエスを十字架につけた。イエスを真ん中にして他の2人の者を両側にイエスと一緒に十字架につけた。ピラトは罪状書きを書いて十字架の上に書きさせた。そこにはユダヤ人のナザレのイエスと書いてあった。イエスが十字架につけられた場所は都に近かったので、多くのユダヤ人がこの罪状書きを読んだ。それはヘブル、ローマ、ギリシャの国語で書いてあった。ユダヤ人の祭司長たちがピラトに言った。ユダヤ人の王と書かずに、この人はユダヤ人の王と自称していたと書いてほしい。ピラトは答えた。私が書いたことは書いたままにしておけ。
So they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him two others, one on either side and Jesus between them. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but rather, this man said, I am the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written.
Okay, so this is the last reading for tonight. Verse 17 again says, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of a skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha.
ヘブル語とで
The sentence
こう
began in
呼ばれる
verse
ところ
16.
に行ったって書いてあるんですね。
And it began, so they took Jesus,
イエスを
and there
連
they,
れて、
the ones who took Jesus, were almost certainly the Roman soldiers who took Jesus.
でもちろんローマの兵士たちがまあ
So
ついていくわけ
In verse 17 where it says he went
17
out,
節には
we're supposed to understand that it was Jesus went out with these soldiers,
兵
and
士
they
たち
went
と
away
一緒に行
from
ったのが
Pilate,
わ
the
かりま
place
す
of judgment where we've just been. Jesus was bearing his own cross.
イエスは自分の十字架を負ったっていうふうに書いてありますね。
Most people say that when people went to be crucified and they bore their own cross, which was fairly common. Evidently, it was common enough that John could write this and people would know exactly what he was talking about. They'd seen people bearing their own cross often enough, around Jerusalem because people are crucified there. What it meant was not like we see so many times, like in church plays and stuff, actually carrying the whole cross, but carrying the cross piece, the top piece that your arms would be attached to, because usually the vertical piece would already be like buried in the ground, and they would hoist the people up onto it, and then nail them in various sometimes use ropes or nails or some combination. People have studied this a lot. I don't really like to talk about it, but Jesus is remembered by John as carrying his own cross. And interestingly, he doesn't mention, as the other gospel authors do, that Jesus had help to carry his cross from Simon of Cyrene. If you look in the synoptic gospels, somebody helped Jesus to carry his cross. In John's gospel, Jesus bore his own cross. And the way people have normally reconciled between the two is they say he went out bearing his own cross, but at some point he got some help to carry it the rest of the way, which lets both accounts work. In the Catholic Stations of the Cross or whatever, they do that. There's some kind of place where Jesus gets help. So he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is Golgotha. And just for your information, the name for the place in Latin is based on the Latin word for skull, which is Calvaria, which is where we get Calvary. So when you hear songs about Calvary or hear Calvary Baptist Church or whatever, it's the Latin version of Golgotha. Here, the Aramaic word Golgotha is used because that Aramaic was like the language that Jesus and his disciples, local people, spoke locally. People do not know exactly where this place is. If you take a tour of the Holy Land, they'll tell you they know where it is, probably. But I think historians and archaeologists aren't exactly sure where Golgotha would be, except that it's fairly clear by lots of reasons, including what you read in verse 20, that it would have been outside the walls of the city, and it would have probably been along a thoroughfare where people coming in and out of Jerusalem would have had to have seen the people being crucified and read the inscriptions for why they were crucified. They didn't do this in an out-of-the-way place. They did it intentionally in a public place, which is the whole reason for crucifixion was it was supposed to be the most horrible form of execution that people knew, and they wanted you to see it so that you wouldn't commit those crimes. And it's evidently just, if you read the medical detail, people who comment on crucifixion, it's just a horrible, horrible way for anybody to die. It's as bad as you can think of. Verse 18, it says, then they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. The other Gospels remember more about these other 2 people between whom Jesus is crucified. You remember the stories in the Synoptic Gospels about how they were both thieves. Actually, I think they use the same word to describe them as they used to describe Barabbas, bandit, or whatever it is. And one of them is hostile to Jesus, and the other one recognizes that Jesus is the Son of God, and Jesus says to the one, truly I say to you, this day you will be with me in paradise. You know the story. It's an important story that all of the Gospels remember. John, though, just wants to remember that Jesus wasn't crucified alone. He was
そ
taken
し
out
て、まあ、
with a
ヨハ
group
ネ
of
はた
people,
だそのこと
all
を
of
思い
them
出
were
して、イ
criminals,
エス様を書いてますね。
and he was crucified, amongst the
です
criminals.
からその、まあ、当人たちの間にイエスが挟まってかけられたということを
What John is,
ヨハネは
although all of them
語ってい
mention it, John is also very interested in this. Verse 19, it says, Pilate
ます。
also
で、
wrote an
19節は
inscription,
こういうことが書いてある。
put it on the cross,
ピラトが罪状書きを
and
書
it
きま
read,
した。
Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews.
Yeah,
Now, all four
Nazareth,
Gospels
yes.
remember Pilate writing something and
Yeah.
basically the same, not exactly, but basically the same message. Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Okay. And people point out, probably you already can figure out yourself, it doesn't mean Pilate was writing these inscriptions himself for all the people
まあ
that
自
were
分が書い
crucified
た
in
と
Rome.
は
And
いうことではないんです
he
けど、
was directing,
そう
the
やって書かせたわけですね、指示して。
inscriptions be prepared, or at least the inscription. I understand that it was common to prepare an inscription and either put it on the cross or around the neck
十
of
字
the
架
person
の上にこう
crucified to show
罪状
why
書き
they
を
were
書
being
く
punished.
わけです。
And in this case, Pilate took a personal interest and determined what would be written on the one that was hung on Jesus. And it's the reason for it to be there is to tell people that walk by what this guy's crime is, right? So in Jesus' case, if they walk by and they saw Jesus on the cross,
罪状をどういうために殺されたかをちゃんと書きたいわけ
they'll
です
see
ね。
the inscription that described here that had been directed by Pilate.
まあ
Right?
ピラトによって指
And
示されて
this
書かれた罪状
inscription
書きです。
Jesus of Nazareth, the King of Nazareth, the King of the
ユ
Jews,
ダヤ
in
人
the
の
space
王
where
ナザ
your
レのイエスと書いたわけです。
crime is typically described,
それ
right?
は
Which,
ま
the way I
あ
read
人
it
々
means
が
that
訴え
Jesus'
た罪状
crime,
ですか
if I
ら、
went to look at it, his crime was being King of the Jews.
ユダヤ人の
And
王
being
で
King
あ
of
る
the
という
Jews,
ことが、まあ
had he
殺された理由なん
the
です
King
ね。
of the Jews, would have been a crime probably that would have let Pilate easily crucify him, right? There was
ですからピラトの側
not
はそんなの
allowed
は
to be any
なんか
king
死罪に当たる
in
ことで
Judea.
はないんですね。
Herod the Great had been a king almost 70 years before, the last king that there had been in that area. But now time to move on, and the Romans didn't allow kings there anymore. So
そして
if there had still been somebody who was king,
国ではもう王
and if he'd been
王がいないんですね
identified and shown up, probably the Romans would have crucified him, as a challenge to Roman authority. And that seems to be the way Jesus got branded here, as a
でもここ
as
で
a
イ
guy
エ
who was
ス
king
は
of
まあユダヤ
the
人
Jews, and
の
therefore was
罪状
crucified.
が
That was
罪
his
状が
that was his
殺された
crime. It seems like from what's written here. And many Jews could read this inscription, verse 26, because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city,
それ
and it
は
was
日
written
本
in
に近かった
Aramaic and
からです
Latin
ね
and Greek.
そしてラテン語とギリシャ語とヘブル語で書
Historians
かれて
and
ます
archaeologists disagree a little bit on this, but just like if you go to a train station or
駅とか
airport
なん
in
か
modern
行くと
day,
そこ
you
に
see
なんかが
Korean and
最後ありま
Japanese
す
and
ね
English and
日
German
本
and
語
French.
とか英語とかいくつか
This was a place around Jerusalem where a lot of Latin speakers, the whole Roman
ロー
army
マの人た
basically
ちが
would
話していた
have,
ラテ
Latin
ン語
would have
で
been
す
their
ね。
main
日本語はロ
language.
ーマ語って書いてます
The main language of the world, sort of like maybe English is today, was Greek
だ
then.
から
Right?
今だ
Most
ったら
people spoke
英語でしょうけど、そ
Greek,
の時は
so they could
ギリ
speak
シ
to
ャ
each
語が一
other.
番よく使われてました
Right?
ね。
And then the
ローマ
local
で使っ
language
ていたローマ
Aramaic,
語と
which
そ
Jesus
れ
and
か
his
らギリシ
disciples
ャ
and people in
語
Jerusalem would have
それとギ
spoken.
リシャ
So
語
it isn't odd to imagine that in many cases for the criminals there, particularly if they wanted people of those three language groups to be warned by the crucifixion, they would have translated the title
訳
into
もまあどういう
Aramaic, Latin, and Greek,
タイ
just
トル
as
で殺さ
they
れたかと
did
いう
for
のを
Jesus.
書
At
く
any rate, Jesus' inscription made it possible for people to read that he was the king of the Jews if they were walking in and out of Jerusalem and happened to go by,
エル
where
サレ
he
ム
was,
に帰
where
帰
he
する
was
人たち、その
crucified.
周りの人たちに分かるように3つの言語
And
で書か
in
れ
the
ていま
time
す。
remaining, I just wanted to wonder a little bit, and maybe you can wonder some more on your own time. How would people
そ
have,
してここで
imagine different kinds of people that would walk by, and you walk up to this guy who's crucified, which is a horrible thing to see.
殺された人を
Only
見
really
た
bad
んですね
criminals go there, right? I mean, and that's why they have the inscription to see what he did that was so bad that
な
they
んでこ
crucified
ん
him.
なに十字架に
And
かけら
they
れ
go up
る
and they say, the thing this guy did that was so bad that they crucified him, huh? He's the king of the Jews, is what it
ちょっとユ
says.
ダヤ人の王
In 3 languages written there. This guy is being crucified because he's the king of the Jews. How would you think, what would you react
それを見た
if
人
you
た
read
ちはどう
something
いう
like
反応をし
that?
たでしょうか、どう思ったで
if you were a Jew, or if you
も
were
し
Roman,
ユダヤ
if
人
you
の
were
人だったらどうでしょう。
somebody else.
あるいは他の国の人でもそれを見たときに。
And what we do know from the Bible is at least how the chief priests reacted. And in verse 21 it tells us the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Don't write the king of the Jews, but rather this man said, I am the king of the Jews."
だからこの男がそう主張したっていうふうに書いてほしいと言いましたね。
Right. So he doesn't like the fact that the inscription says Jesus actually was the king of the
だ
Jews.
からイエスは本当はユダヤ人の
His crime to be that he was claiming to be the king of the Jews. That seems to be important to him for some reason.
だからもう最初た
And
ち
so I'm really interested in what, I was myself interested when the chief priest saw what Pilate had written. Why was he
ピラト
so
はそれを書かせましたね。
worked up that he actually went to Pilate and asked him to change it? Why does the chief priest care?
で、
To see that-
最初たちが
to see that
こ
inscription
れで、訴えた、ね、ように
He
何が
walks up and he looks and
問
he
題
says,
だったんでしょうか、
It
最
says
初たち
Jesus
に
is
と
the
って
king of the Jews. And
最初はそ
he
れを見
runs
て、
to
驚
Pilate
い
and
て、
says,
急
You have
い
to
で
change
ピラト
the
のところ
inscription
で
and
書
say,
き直してくれと言いました。
not that he is the king of the Jews, but that he claimed to be the king of the Jews. Why?
Maybe he's starting to see the sin in himself.
自分たちの罪を
So maybe he started to realize that it was actually true.
でしょうか。
Yeah. Well, isn't it? Yeah. I don't know.
Okay, if you want to, Greg, if you want to say.
王だと認めない
He,
ということ
they,
認めたくないということで
didn't
王だと言
want
ったこと
to
が罪だと言って王だ
that
ということを書
Jesus
かない
was a
という
king.
ことですか
So the chief priest didn't want to admit that Jesus was the king.
で、イエスがなんか王であるということを最初たちは本当に認めたくないですね。
That's clear, right?
本
That's
当にそれだけははっきりしてると思います。
why.
なぜそうなんでしょう。認めたくないということはなぜ
He's just interested in accuracy, or Steve?
It's probably just an elaboration of what was just said, because what you say is, I think, absolutely correct, but their concern is
で、彼らの
very
意識はどう
political.
でしたでしょうか。
very political.
Is that
If they really say
もし
He
彼ら
is
が
the
本
king
当
of the
に彼は
Jews, then why are the
ユダヤ
chief
人を王だと言ったと
priests
したら
allowing the king of the
最初
Jews
たちは
to be
認めたことになってしまう
crucified as a common criminal that
でそ
only
れ
the
が
Romans
ただ
could
のユダヤ
crucify
人
you
の王
for?
が普通の罪人として死んだこと
I
になる
think
わ
that
けで
was
すね。
there something very, very
That's-
scared of.
that's
それはもう本当に
If
恐
he
れ
really
る
is
状
the
態だ
king,
と思います。
then the Jews are very bad subjects, right? Because they're not doing anything to help them. They're just leaving their king to die on a cross without lifting a finger to help.
And the fact that they said they had no king but Caesar really puts them in a bind.
Okay.
Okay, he want to say something.
シーザーとキングの違いですか
Is there a difference between
Like a
the
political-
Caesars and king of Jews?
Well, Caesar was an emperor of the whole world.
まあ
I think,
そう
almost,
当
but
時このシーザーっていうのはローマ
Like
帝
our
国の
king is
全
kind
部の
of
皇帝ですよ
king.
ね。
King would be more local.
Yes.
で、キングは地方の王様です。
I guess, yeah, that's it. That Caesar, I mean Caesar, Jesus, if he's king of the Jews, he's been
ユダヤ人
anointed
の王
king.
っていうこ
So
とです
there,
ね。
he's looking at, if he's admitting that, then it's actually admitting that the anointed one is put
まあ
up there on the
神様
cross.
によって油注がれたものを王様なんですね、ユダヤ人。
And anointed is much greater than just getting the position.
その立場につくということよりか、神によって油注がれたということはすごい重要なことなんですね。やっぱりユダヤの社会において。
Yeah, I think I think it's an interesting question to keep thinking about.
だからそ
I
の質問はとても重要だと思うので、興味深いと
picked
思
up
う
on
の
what
で
you guys
考
are saying,
え
and
続
I
けて
might
く
have
だ
picked
さい。
up one or two other things. I'm thinking one possibility is that
一つは
The chief priest-
最初たちは
if there's a guy hanging on a cross,
今十字架にかかっている男がですね、こ
the
こで
king
ユ
of
ダ
the Jews, one
ヤ
possible
の王って書い
implication
て
is
ある。
that there actually is royalist insurrection in Judea, right? I mean,
だからユダヤ
there's a party out
の
there
王
that's rebelling against Rome to the point where the Roman soldiers are actually having to put to death people who
そしてロー
claim
マ
to be
の
king
役
would be
人が
one
それを
possibility.
罪状
Or
として殺したと
they look at the pitiful form of Jesus and they're embarrassed. I think this is close to what you guys were
それ
saying
は確か
because
にちょっとなんていうか恥ずべき
how could anybody suppose that a king of the Jews would be A, so mean and pitiful as this guy Jesus up there on the cross, and B, so easily abandoned by his people, right? What does that say about Israel? If you could have such a king abandoned in this way by its people, that would be embarrassing, right?
だからそれがローマの兵によってそういうことをされて
Or he could be frightened that
状態はやっぱ
the you know, underneath somewhere he could be frightened that the inscription was somehow true. But I think one of the things that a lot of people would say
でたくさんの人はこういうことも考えて
is we can never lose sight of the fact that everything that's going on here
こ
is
こで
being
行われている
superintended
ことは
by God.
神によってまあ
And one of the things that's happening on the cross is God is revealing himself to the
彼自
world
身が
in
世界
Jesus the way he
に
wants to be revealed.
表したことなんです
And
ね。イエスをみんなの
You
前
know,
に
the forces of evil are opposing that however they can. So just as Pilate is being used as an instrument, you know,
まあピラトを
so
使ってそういうこと
so
に
too the
追いや
chief
ったんです
priest
け
is
れども
probably on the side of evil here, and he's trying to cover up the truth because it is the
だ
truth.
から本当に起こったことを最初たちは隠したいんです
Irony
ね
in the whole
ここ
thing.
But
で
anyway, those are
そうい
just
うこ
some
とを言う人は
possibilities.
たくさんいます
Let's finish up here. So then Pilate answers him, and he says,
それ
"What
に
I
対
have
して
written."
ピラ
I
ト
have
は答
written.
えてますね
So the chief priest, for one or several of those reasons,
もう
really
最
thinks
初は
that
す
that
い
should
ま
be
せんやめてくだ
amended.
さいとこう言いに行ったのに対して
Pilate, on
ピ
the
ラト
other
は言いま
hand,
す
doesn't want to amend it, right? He refuses to change what he had written. So I ask
変
you,
えたがらなかった自分の
the same
考え
question.
ですね
when the chief priest objects, why does Pilate refuse?
なんで
Well, I
ピ
guess
ラ
that
トはな
doesn't
ぜ
that shift
最
the
初た
blame?
ちが訴えたのに変えなかったんでしょ
I
う
mean,
か
he can basically say okay, fine. So you want to crucify the king of the Jews?
ユダ
Fine.
ヤ人の王だって言って、まあ、罪状をそう言ったん
I
ですけ
think
ど
that, yeah, I mean, if Jesus really is the king of the Jews,
でイエスは本当に
it's much easier for Pilate to explain to everybody what he did, right?
Hmm.
Here's the king of the Jews.
イエスが、まあ、ユダヤの王
There
と
can't
し
be
て
a
います
king of the Jews under Roman law.
ロー
I
マの
crucified
法
this
律
guy
によって
because he
は
was the
ない
king
で
of the
す
Jews. And Rome says, okay.
だから
That's the argument of the Jews, right?
Yeah.
They said, crucify him because he's the king. And Pilate says, okay, I got no choice now.
でもうピラトの方は
So,
じゃあもう
it would be bad for him if he changed it,
自分はそうします
because then he would lose his justification for what he did, right? That's
Yeah.
your point.
だからピラトはそういう人々の要求のままにしてそのまんまで、まあ、いいわけですねピラトの側
Do you have any
は
idea?
I think this is writing iPhone same thing. 罪ではなくてジーザスさんのユダヤの王という名前で記されているので罪というよりは
That is not that
罪状でもありますけど事実なん
いや
です
何ちょっと待ってなんだっけ罪状っていうの英語inscription okay is that inscription or
Yeah.
私は勉強が足りないです。
いやそんなことない何言って
I don't know, in Latin it's like titulus, and in Greek it's a similar word. We get the English word title or something
英
like
語で言うと、ま
So-
あ、タイトルっていう
Yeah, title, I think.
Yeah. So what's the point?
うん
罪状という
うん罪状
彼
なのか
がそういうふうに言ったから
それともね名前なのかっていう
罪状として書けっていうふうに言ったことが罪状だって書けって言われたんですけど、ピラトはどっちの意味にも取れるので、彼はユダヤの王だって書いておけば罪状にも見えるし、彼の名前にもなるし、
So that
そうついたことにならない
insisted to that remain that is that inscription and his title.
because
It's that
he doesn't
has
lie.
the two meanings.
Yeah. So surely, for many years, Christians have understood that when Pilate wrote that inscription, he was telling the truth. We know it's the truth.
で、
And
多
so
くの人
God is
たち
causing
が
the
ピラ
truth
ト
to
の
be
書い
written
た
by the
ことは
hand
ま
of
さしく
Pilate.
真実なことを書いたという
And that's one of the answers to this question.
結果的には。
But Pilate also may, in some sense, have had that sense, or he may think that he might as well just go ahead and make it official. The Jews wanted Jesus crucified for that reason, and
で、まあ、
let's
ユダ
just
ヤ
let
人の
Jesus
人た
be
ち
the,
は本当に
the
ユ
king
ダ
of the
ヤ
Jews,
イエ
if
スを
that's
殺
what they
し
say,
たそ
right?
の
The
理由
people
は
have
それ
actually
なんで
made
す
him
ね。
king
だからその
in
ま
order
ん
to
ま
crucify him.
を書いておくべきと
I also get this
ピラトは
sense
思った
when he says, "What I've written, I've written." It's just like,
I can't be bothered, right? Leave me
leave me
alone.
alone. I'm the boss.
Yeah,
Just shut up.
I think so too. So I have that. He just couldn't be bothered. Also, the Jews are annoying him at this point, and he says, you know, I don't care what you guys want to do. I'm finished.
うん
He might have recognized something in Jesus, which we know he did.
意味は罪状の意味だけだってことで
Yeah,
す
he
ね。
does.
He didn't want to explain why he had crucified a man for pretending to be the king of the Jews, right? There's all kind of crazy people that run around pretending to be king of this, that, or the other thing, right? So Pilate wouldn't just crucify a child or a mentally impaired person who said, I'm the king of Judea. They don't crucify people for that, right? You crucify a guy because he makes a legitimate claim to be the king of the Jews. So it really sort of does make sense that Pilate stuck with his original writing. And it makes sense that his original writing was superintended by God and was actually true. And helped to clarify what's actually happening there on the cross. And I guess we're done time-wise today, but I guess you could say that when you look at questions like this of why did this happen,
どうしてこういうことが起こったのかということを、自分で問い続けてみたいと思うんですけどね。
you can see the fulfillment of divine purpose in a
そこ
simple
に
way,
神
but
様の目
the
的があ
human
る
motives that feed into it
だ
can
か
be
ら
very
人間の側
complex,
からすれば
right?
いろんなことを考えますけども、
Pilate was a complicated man. He probably had 10 different reasons for everything
ピラ
that he
ト
did,
の側
right?
に
And
立
the
って
Jews
いろいろ
too.
な理由があったと思
We're
うんですけ
sinful
ど、
human beings. We do stuff for all
罪
kinds
あ
of
る
reasons.
人
We're not
間
even
の
sure
犯し
all
た
the
こと
reasons
でも
why
あるわけ
we
です
do
よ
it.
ね。
But God knows what He's doing,
だ
and
けど神
all
様
of
の
history is
側は
bending
そこに
towards this point where Jesus is going to go to the cross and die for the forgiveness of the sins of the world, and nothing's going to stop it. Not human sin, not
ま
Satan,
ずですからもう人間の
Not
思いで
Caesar.
はなく、
not Pilate,
ピラ
not
ト
the
の
chief
思いでもな
priest.
く。
Nothing's going to stop it. Okay, time's up.
時間なのでここでお願いします。
Thank you all for coming tonight, and let's pray. Dear God, once again, I ask your blessing on the things that we read and study. These are very important things, and I'm always worried that we might misunderstand or misteach or misapply these things. Lord, I ask your grace on Bible study, that when we open up the Bible, we don't need to be afraid, that we understand that you're the one who's here amongst us, leading us into the truth. So many things we can try to understand are too great for us to ever really understand, but we know, Lord, that you love us, that you died for us, and that you're our Savior and you're our King, and that part of what we should be doing is opening up the Bible and trying to understand these things which are too great and too deep for us sometimes. Anyway, Lord, thank you for this time tonight, and please be with everyone here and help them get home safely. Please be with the people who couldn't be with us tonight for whatever reason, and have your eye on them too. And as always, I wish to ask you please to bless this church and our pastors and the people who worship here. We hope that everything that happens here will be pleasing to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.